What would it feel like if here in your own country, you were treated as if you didn't belong by your school, by the healthcare system, by the justice system? On top of that, what if even in your own home, you didn't feel the sense of safety and protection that parents are supposed to provide for their children? I'm describing a well-worn path between a kid who doesn't have the support structure or protection that many Australians take for granted and a life that's in and out of institutions. So what would it take to avert that path? What would it take to help a child who's in trouble like that to find a different way through life? The answer to that question and the outcomes of that kind of intervention are going to surprise you. Sam Alderton Johnson is a proud Koori man and the founder of Impact Policy, a 100% Aboriginal-owned business launched to provide social policy and digital communication services, embedding every project that they deliver with a critical First Nations lens. Now, Sam's story is as powerful as it is confronting. And in a year where we as a country are going to be asked in a referendum to give that voice in a way that we've never been able to give it before, this is an important chat to hear. I'm so stoked to talk to you, buddy. How are you going today, mate?
Yeah, look, I'm good, brother. I'm good. I really appreciate you taking the time to have us on, and I've been following you for a long time. Read your book not too long back, and yeah, really, really excited to connect.
Mate, I'm always grateful to have a conversation like this, and you are an incredible success story. And I'll say this: unfortunately, you are a one in not many. You know, you are one.
100%.
You're a unicorn for what you have done, and a lot of people have worked really hard, and you've repaid that work by taking those opportunities and your story is just so incredible, and I really really want people to hear it. Where you are now and the path you have blazed behind you that other people are following now is so incredible. Sam, we're talking to each other. You're in Sydney at the moment?
Yeah, I'm in Sydney. I'm on Gadigal country here.
Where did you grow up?
Grew up in Glebe in the city. Lived there most of my life. Really privileged to grow up in a very strong Aboriginal community. Very cultural, diverse community as well, and a very strong and resilient community, but a one that was very much full of a lot of social disadvantage, a lot of trauma, and a lot of challenges that come along with that growing up as well.
The really heavy story. I was talking with Briggs about this the other night because I just dropped names of my Aboriginal friends.
That's him.
That he talks. Briggs has this great line of people want their indigenous experience, so they book a ticket and go to the Gama Festival. He goes like, look in your own city, right there in the inner city of Sydney. People know the Redfern, but the Glebe, absolutely. Like, it's right 100%. There. That culture is right there.
Totally. And to be honest, in this country, it's a travesty, in Sydney, like it's the site of first contact, it's a site of invasion. And we've got the strongest, staunchest community in La Perouse that are thriving. But, people talk about, experiencing Aboriginal culture and connecting with communities, and they're often thinking about, going to immersion trips in the Northern Territory and all that sort of stuff as well, and leaving their states and their cities when, exactly like you said, more often than not, they're closely connected to Aboriginal communities already. They just haven't, found the opportunity to connect and build those relationships as well.
How early on when you were a kid did you kind of realize, hang on, everyone looks, I'm not a part of this bigger thing?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, and it's a really not so much a complex question, but one maybe for people outside of our community to understand. You look at me and you two don't look too dissimilar, Osher. You know, I'm a fair-skinned black fella, and I know that the world also reads me outside of my community very, very differently as well. And whilst I've always been very proud of who I am and where my family's from, I knew from a very young age that the world experienced me very differently than some of my friends and family that I grew up with in my community. So, you talk about systemic inequity and injustice. You touched on some of that a little bit earlier. I've got memories as a kid growing up in Glebe where, me and other kids had done, cheeky or, criminal sort of stuff.
Victimless
And
crimes. Victimless crimes.
always victimless crimes. And, but it was always my dark-skinned brothers that were thrown up against a police car, that were, had their phones ripped out of their pockets and smashed on the ground and all that sort of stuff. And my experience of police was very different based on how I was read, and I was very conscious of that from a young age as well. So, culturally in our communities, if you have a strong sense of your identity and your connection, how you look doesn't mean anything. But it's also about how the world outside of our communities reads us as well. And the reality is that for me, my experience of Australia is also very privileged as a black fella because of how the world can read me as well sometimes. And you mentioned at the start, your partner's Pacific Islander. My partner's Pacific Islander as well, and having grown up with those experiences as a kid and seeing how my family and friends have been treated makes me really scared and conscious of the realities of the world for my kids as well. My kids are very, experienced. They're read very differently to how I'm read, and all that sort of stuff. So those fears of profiling, over policing, systemic barriers that they may experience in their life are very, very prevalent, and big fear as well.
I think it's important. We should talk about that. People would say, like, if you're listening to this podcast still, I'd say you'd probably like to think, oh, I don't have a bias against, First Nations people. I would treat a non-white person the same as white people. I'm an educated person and I see things different. What have you learned about unconscious? I mean, I know I was shocked when I, investigated my own unconscious bias. I was shocked because it confronted how I felt that I thought about the world. What have you learned about unconscious bias?
Yeah, look, I think one of the first things is for anyone that might be experiencing what you just said when you learnt about that and feeling shocked is to not feel guilty that you might have an unconscious bias, because the real reality is that there's a media misrepresentation and bias of how Aboriginal people and communities are portrayed. That's just a fact. There was a Senate inquiry only the other week into missing and murdered Aboriginal people in this country, and one of the key things that came out of that was the media bias and misrepresentation of missing and murdered First Nations people in this country. There's been extensive studies and research that show that that the lives and the representations of our people in the media are not represented equitably, and that skews broader public opinion and perceptions about our people and our culture. So when people when you say you went on that journey and you're a bit shocked, and someone else that's listening to this might go on that journey and be a bit shocked, like that's we're growing up in environments where we've had people that are maybe your age, Osher, that have grown up at school being told that Captain Cook discovered Australia and not learning about the stolen generations and the policies that were put in place to segregate our communities and dispossess us from our country and our culture. So like the reality is that people have had a lot of things stacked against them in terms of understanding our people and our culture and the strength and beauty of it too. So but there's no question asked that there's definitely some structural things in place that make it really hard for the Australian community to really come along on this journey of truth and justice and walk alongside with us.
The first thing you said there was like, when we discover our unconscious bias, don't feel guilty. What's the next thing we can do.
Next thing we do is once you uncover it, it's about being curious. I reckon it's about being curious about where that's sort of come from, and then taking a bit of action in terms of looking at how best you can maybe not rediscover, but reevaluate some of those perspectives that you might have held for a while at different stages of your identity or your youth, or wherever you are at that stage of your journey. I think it's important to understand that our people in our culture are very much we've talked about media bias and misrepresentation as well, but a lot of the dialogue around our people and our culture and our history comes from a deficits dialogue. There's close the gap. We're talking about the over representation of our people in prison, the fact that we die 20 years younger than non-Aboriginal Australia, all these, systemic problems and issues in our country as well. And they're critical and they're so important. But it's also important to remember that being here and in this country, we're connected to the oldest continuous culture on the planet, and there is so much strength and pride and resilience and so much that we can learn from culture and country that is still alive and still thriving. So whilst there's much bias and representation, and there's also a lot of dialogue in policy and in government around the problems and the issues, all really valid, that need attention and to be addressed, there's also a real absence of the fact that we should actually be really, as a country, proud and really looking for opportunities to embed Aboriginal language, Aboriginal knowledge, Aboriginal culture into everything that we do, because it's what makes this country so special and great. And once we start to move past that understanding of, perhaps that unconscious bias that we may have lived with, we can start to really move into actually, I've been living, perhaps a part of my life where I've really had this perception that is actually almost in a lot of ways a polar opposite to how I should be thinking about how, I connect with country and culture and communities here in my own place of the world as well. So yeah, it's not an easy answer sometimes, and the journey is going to look different for everyone. But I think there's some of the key principles, if I could try and tie it together.
Yeah, you're right in that the only time we really see positive words or a sentiment attributed to a First Nations Aboriginal person is if they're an athlete and they're successful and they don't say anything.
Definitely. Totally.
That's pretty much it. Win your gold medal, win the footy game, and be quiet.
That's right. That's right.
You're not allowed to say both, which is a real shame and has happened far too much in our history. But we, with every day, we have an opportunity to do things differently. We've been speaking a bit about systems and the government intervention in people's lives. You are a person that your youth there was a lot of engagement with some of these systems, wasn't there?
Yeah, massively. We talk about forced child removal and, the impacts of the stolen generations and all that sort of stuff as well. That's something that my family's very closely connected to. But even within my generation, my sister was living with my father in the block in Redfern, very notorious part of the Aboriginal community in Sydney. And they lived with my father down there on the block for a period of time, but that was the place where my sister was removed. So, Friday night, the police came in and banged down the door and took my sister away at 7 years old, and she never came home. She went into the system, and that was her story. And people want to talk about the systemic barriers and letdowns around that sort of stuff. And, whilst they're complex, I can share some stories that help provide some insight. I remember being 16 years old, and I left home when I was very young, so I wasn't living in the family home, but I still stayed connected to my sister and my family. But I lived in foster care placements as well with Barnardos, who I know you're a big advocate and supporter of too. But at this point in time, my father was homeless and he had care of my sister. And my mum had a diagnosed mental health condition. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so I grew up, experiencing, living with a parent who's navigating that. And she battled dual diagnosis because she experienced a lot of complex trauma as a child and dealt with a lot of addiction and that. And so, as you know, with dual diagnosis, I know you're familiar with that reference, the impacts
double
of
winners,
that.
baby. Double winners.
That's it. That's it. That's it. But, I remember being 16 with my father, and he was homeless with my sister, and walking into, Department of Communities and Justice is the name of the government agency in New South Wales at the moment, but they've been called FACS, DOCS, a range of different names in the past. But I remember walking in there into those doors with him, and him begging for help with housing. I've got nowhere to go. I've got a 6-year-old daughter here. Please, I need help. I need a house. I need some sort of support, some sort of emergency accommodation. And the support that they said, look, we can't do anything for you. All we can do is we can put you in a room, and you can try and, here's a phone book. I think maybe it was a phone book, or here's a list of numbers, and you can call some crisis. So no support, no opportunity to advocate and support a parent that's homeless with a 6-year-old. So he gets put into this room. My father's, semi-literate at the best of times, and he sits there and he maybe calls 1 or 2 numbers, and then he goes, fuck this, and he just gets up and he leaves. Less than a year later, he finds himself living down at the block in Redfern. And surprise, surprise, on the Friday night, the same service that he begged for help less than a year ago came in on a Friday night and took his daughter away. And then the system couldn't work out why this father is so aggressive and angry and won't engage with them, And so he's got a lot of, his own issues and trauma, but he was super aggressive and, very hard for any of these caseworkers to navigate. And he was, labeled, all these labels. And I just remember thinking as a kid, like, hang on a second, this is someone who came begging for help. And then you've literally came and ripped this kid out of his hands. It's so we talk about like the complexity of the system, the overwhelming burden on the system, the resources and the lack of support for families to be kept together. All the research says that if we can invest those resources into actually keeping kids with their families and looking at a family-centered approach as opposed to just taking kids and addressing immediate issues, that the long-term impacts are more positive for our families and our communities. But look, that's just one example of a multitude. But yeah, I left home at a very young age. I left home at 15, and I'd had leukemia actually at the age of 14, and I found myself in the hospital, and my father and my mother's addiction and my mother's mental health stuff sort of just really took a spiral. I think the trauma of having a child go through such a life-threatening thing at that age really triggered a lot of that trauma, and so that stuff really amplified. So luckily enough, the social workers within the hospital could see that, hang on a second, this kid's parents are really not well. And so luckily the social workers intervened and made a referral for Barnardo's to be engaged. And then I got the opportunity to live in a foster care placement. So I left home at 15 and lived in foster care placements in King's Cross, around Sydney and all that sort of stuff. And never went back home to live. And yeah, finished my high school. I was living by myself since the age of 17 in a unit, semi-independent housing, they were calling it, in Barnardo's at the time. And finished my year 12 completely by myself, away from all that, and navigating my sister's removal and placement into the foster care system. So yeah, it was pretty complex and pretty challenging sort of time. But
I went to school with a guy whose parents fostered kids. I think by the time we were in grade 12, he had 34 people or 35 people that he had grown up. They were a pretty special family. I know that's not everyone's foster care experience.
Yeah, definitely.
In the same way that, when people talk about stepfathers or stepmothers, it's usually the wicked stepmother trope. That's the one we hear, or the powerful, like overpowering stepfather. We don't hear that. We only hear that side of it. So what was your foster care experience like? It must have been super scary to suddenly be with these strangers who probably wanted to help.
Yeah, definitely. Look, I think my sister particularly, so like my sister went in as a child. She was 7 years old. She never left. But she was very, very lucky because I've got a lot of friends who I grew up with who'd been through the system, and their stories are really tragic in terms of the placements, the number of placements, and how they've navigated it. So she actually stayed with the same placement. So they have a crisis short-term carers. Those carers put their hands up to take care of her for the long term. So she had the same placement from the age of 7 to as an adult. So that's like her second family. So she was very, very lucky. But I sort of say that in haste because she also missed out on so much. She's lost so much connection to culture, her own sense of identity, her own sense of connection to community. She was from really strong Aboriginal communities that she's completely lost connection to, and all that sort of stuff, which we know is so critical for our health, our well-being, and all that sort of stuff in the long term. So, her experience was, one of the probably better stories if you look at it from a systems perspective. But regardless of how you think about it from a cultural perspective, very little of those needs were met when it came to what she needed as an Aboriginal young person. My experience, I just turned 15, right? So I'm a 15-year-old teenager. I came from a bit of a, Glebe's a rough community. I was a bit of a rough kid before I'd gotten a bit sick. A lot of, silly sort of stuff, petty youth crime, all that sort of stuff. So to find myself living in King's Cross in a foster care placement just sort of blew my mind, because I thought Glebe was a tough place to grow up in, but living in King's Cross behind on Victoria Street, behind Darlinghurst Road at the age of 15, and seeing, people injecting in the streets, in the laneways, and I'd see girls that I grew up with in Glebe selling drugs at the train station there at King's Cross, on the way back from school. And so I just remember thinking like, oh, this is a chaotic place to put a young person that's at risk of being at home. But my placement wasn't the best one, not because of anything wrong with the person that put their hand up, but it was just that I think I was probably at an age where I didn't want a parent. I didn't want another parent. I was a 15-year-old teenager, but what I probably needed was a mentor. And so it wasn't the best fit. I grew up in a house with a lot of addiction, right? So I'm probably one of the anomalies in the space where, like, I actually hate being around alcohol and drugs, and so as a kid in a placement, like, my foster parent wasn't an alcoholic, but he liked to drink. He liked to have people over on a Friday night and they'd have a bit of a party or whatever. And so as a young person, like, that really triggered me, and I really didn't like that. And I really didn't feel safe about being around that.
If you've been growing up in the environment you've been growing up on, the smell of beer means later on something's going to get broken.
Exactly.
And you're just waiting for it to happen.
Totally.
And it might never happen, but that's the, it's like, I don't know, say you got bitten by a dog when you were, 4. Every dog, even my stupid cavoodles, will terrify you because that's what dogs do. It's the smell of wine or whiskey or beer. That's enough to make you go, there's going to be a fight. This is the smell of fights,
100%.
And that can be hard for people to understand. So if you're about 15, so what's your recourse for that? You're 15, you've been moved for your own care. At the age of 15, are you able to go, guys, I don't know, this isn't working out?
Yeah, look, I was actually really lucky in Barnardo's. I had an amazing caseworker. My sister, in her placement as a kid, had about, easily 20, 30, maybe more caseworkers throughout her journey. There was a different one every couple of weeks, every month. Oh. And whereas my story, I was a connection with Barnardo's for 4 years, and I had the same caseworker that whole time. And that's so critical for community services and community development, is that consistency, particularly for young people or communities that have experienced trauma. And so for me, I was really lucky. So she could see that, like, that wasn't the best placement for where my needs were at. And so she really advocated for me because I was hardly spending any time at the home. I'd just go back to Glebe and I'd just float around. And so she really advocated for me to move into this semi-independent house. So I basically moved into that when I got into year 11, and I lived by myself for year 11 and year 12. And that's how it was. So it was very isolating, and, it was very alone, but in a lot of ways, it was the best of a bad situation, and could have been a lot worse as well.
And what were you doing at the time? Like, you've got a lot to unpack. You're dealing with your sister. You're dealing with your parents. Have you got support? Are you talking to a psych?
No, look, I had a really great intervention with a counsellor, and that was only because my girlfriend that I was going out with, she lived in a young girls' refuge in Erskineville, an amazing women's refuge called Lillian's, for anyone that's listening. They do amazing work, and she lived there. And so I'd follow my girlfriend around and she went to this counsellor in Marrickville at Rosemount, Good Shepherd Services. And while I was there, they were like, "Oh, but do you want to see a counsellor?" And I was like, "Oh, while I'm here, I may as well." Would never have sought out help as a young person, never, ever. But it was the best clinical community intervention I could have had at that age. And, really great soft entry as well. It wasn't sort of something that was pushed at me or anything like that. But yes, I was lucky I had a small counselling intervention, and there's actually a really interesting story about that when we talk about, you've touched on some of the systemic barriers about kids getting taken away and families getting pulled apart. And when my sister was removed, not long after she was removed, I was in a counselling session. And funnily enough, my phone rings in the counselling session. And I'm a 17-year-old kid. Answer the phone. Or 18. I might have been 18, actually. I was still in high school, though. I answered the phone, and this caseworker at the time said, "Oh, hey, Sam, your sister, she's demonstrated some promiscuous behaviour. So we're cutting all contact with you and anyone in the family." Not that anyone in my family had seen her. And I was like, "Oh, okay." And that was it. It was just really blunt. That was the end of the phone call, hung up. And luckily, I was in this counselling session with this counsellor, and the counsellor could read my face. She's like, "What was that about? What happened?" So I had the opportunity to unpack what had just happened with a professional in front of me. And she knows that I'm not full of shit because she's literally watched it happen in front of her. And she goes, "This is not right. Let me call you." So she called my Barnardo's worker, and between her and my Barnardo's worker, they coordinated this case conference with my sister's workers and their bosses. And out at the Barnardo's office, there was about 8 people, and I had my best mate was there as a support person. We all sat in this circle, and we said, this is the only connection that this young kid has to her family, and this is the only connection he has to her family. This doesn't make any sense that a knee-jerk reaction like this would happen where you'd completely cut their contact. And they all talked about it. Anyway, the decision was made, let's keep the contact as it is. We'll monitor what's going on. We'll all keep talking, and we'll make sure everything's all good. And so, the worker that had made that call, she never looked at me. And never said nothing, never apologized, just, walked out. And I remember I was, 17-year-old kid, Osher, and I just thought, fuck, man, lucky I was in that room with that counsellor when I got that phone call, or I never would have seen my sister again, because I didn't have the agency to be able to advocate for myself. And that's the story of what happens to our families and our communities. That's how we get torn apart. That's how we get dislocated and disconnected. And I was just so lucky that I was just in the right place at the right time and had a couple of support services that could be there for me.
Yeah, sorry, I've just tears coming in my eyes, man, just thinking about, if that was my brother, or, how old was your sister at the time?
She was 7. So she was 7, I was 17.
Promiscuous behavior at 7? What the fuck? That's a fucking trauma response, if anything.
Totally.
Get around the fucking kid. Totally. Jesus Christ. To dehumanize, that the other person wouldn't look you in the eye. That she wouldn't, to how what's going on in your heart?
Yeah.
How, do you need to get out of the industry if that's where you are? And that's fair enough. If you've been exposed to this shit every day, I understand you might have fatigue. I get that your decision making. Take a break, dude.
Totally.
If you're making calls like that, just dehumanizing a child who's clearly in danger to the point where you're like, nah, it's Jesus.
Yeah, definitely.
Go do something else for a while.
Definitely.
Because I think about, I'm trying to think about what happened to her. What happened to her? What has to happen in your life that you will just completely, wash your hands of the welfare of a powerless child, 7 years old, who's clearly demonstrating something that is in response to something that's going on in her life.
Totally.
That's, oh, fuck me. I'm so happy that happened for you. But you're right. Just the stars and planets aligned and it was able to happen. But, to be left out, against these impenetrable barriers, unable to navigate these things. That's the kind of thing we were talking about at the start of the fair go. That is not a fucking fair go. And there's no way that you at 17 or she at 7 could ever get that kind of fair go. I'm real impressed that you were still in school and you stayed in school. What was it about staying in school that, clearly was something okay about it, you stuck around.
Yeah, look, to be honest, it was probably getting sick. Before I got sick, I was doing a lot of petty crime. I got kicked out of my first high school in year 7 in the first 4 weeks at Balmain High. Found myself at Glebe High School, suspended multiple times again. Petty crime, drug use, all this sort of stuff was happening. Wasn't going down the greatest of paths, like many young people in my community, just navigating how we survive the trauma and the struggle that we've been born into. That might resonate with some people, it might not, but it was what it was.
When you see stuff like that in your grade 7, what's that? You're 12, you're 13.
Yeah.
If the age of criminality is 10, like that is clearly a trauma response. If you're using at 12, you're not using because you want to get high. You're using because you want something to stop. You want something to go away.
Totally.
All right. So to criminalize a trauma response, it's so completely inhuman. And fuck me, like, sorry, I've just there's so much to talk about. It's really quite, but it's important to have these conversations. It's important to be with how uncomfortable it's being in my body, to think about what I got to have that you didn't get to have, and what our system does to people who are navigating in the only ways I know how. People like your father who are homeless with a child, if they steal food, like they're just trying to feed the kid. Like, don't call the cops on them, man. They're just trying to fucking feed their child, right?
That's the story of our justice system too. I've got an honours degree in criminology, and we talk about media bias and misrepresentation. Overwhelming amount of people in prison are dealing with diagnosed mental health conditions, issues around alcohol and drug addiction, and have come from overwhelming experiences of childhood trauma. So it's not the issues aren't around crime. The issues are around healing and how we think about healing, and we think about trauma and all that sort of stuff in terms of how we think about justice. So, it's I could talk. We could talk a lot about. We talk a lot about our prison system and the job we ask it to do. So you got sick. What happened when you were sick? On the other side of you getting into remission, that changed your path. Yes, I think having to go through something like that at that age really gave me a bit of an insight into, your own mortality. And you're 14 years old and you're confronted with the fact that you might die. That's a real reality. So as a 14-year-old trying to process that makes you think a lot about purpose and what's all this about. And I got really sick, and I even had a stroke. I had a bad reaction to a medication that's injected into my spine that goes up into your brain. That's about trying to make sure no secondary cancers come into your brain. And I had a side effect as a result of that. I had a stroke, so I was paralyzed down my left side for 4 days in the brain trauma unit when I went through that journey. You think about. I used to think about people that have a stroke as like in the movies when someone has a heart attack, it just sort of happens. But for me, that stroke happened over like almost a 48-hour period. So I went through all that in the space of 12 months. So I came off the back of that with this sort of motivation, I guess, to want something out of my life. And so that was probably a big reason about why I stayed connected and stuck in at school. That's not to say that, the wheels didn't fall off again, because I found myself again once I was better. Luckily, I went straight into remission after I was very, very sick for 12 months. But then I was sort of, very much back to normal after that in a lot of ways. I found myself back into the same structural and community challenges and trauma that I was surrounded from before that. So, it wasn't a perfect recovery and trajectory into wanting to have a perfect life. I still had to navigate and overcome all those real pressures in my community. And that was still there right up until I finished high school. And then, in only just on Monday, New South Wales has increased the age from 18 to 21 for support for young people living in out-of-home care. New South Wales was one of the last states. Adelaide was the most recent. So when I was 18, I was supposed to be kicked out of Barnardo's, not kicked out, but I was supposed to be exited from Barnardo's with nowhere to go again.
Well done. Off you go, life.
That's it.
Yeah.
And luckily, I'd repeated because I was sick. So I was 19 when I finished my HSC, and all the workers were like, fuck, we can't, this kid's gone, he's in year 12 now, he's gone through so much, we can't just exit him. So they were really good at bending the policy and keeping me there. But once I finished year 12, that was it. And I had to be exited, and I was homeless again. And I was, that was the reality again for quite a while until I got some stability.
Were you able to keep in touch with the people from Barnardo's? You'd had a relationship with these people for years by now.
Yeah, look, my caseworker did her very best to, I ended up getting into uni after high school. So I got into uni. I was really stubborn about going to uni and proving that I could be there and that I could be there just like any other kid. So I wanted to enroll, and I went there and I did my first semester. My caseworker helped me enroll and all that sort of stuff. But after that, that was it. I was couch surfing and I was homeless again. And she tried to set up some, post-exit sort of strategies, but they just all fell apart. And there was just a lack of services that were available. So, I was homeless for pretty much that whole year in that first year of university.
You talk about the high schools you went to. We're talking like, 18, 20 years ago now. I'm sure they're somewhat different. They might be none different at all, but they're kind of, bit gritty, rough around the edges kind of places with everyone who's just from the area. So that's who they are. Suddenly you're at university with people from all over the country, all over the world, all different kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds. What was it like sitting in that first big kind of couple of lectures before everyone figures out, I can just skip this and go to the tute? Yeah, fine. Like with those first couple of ones, the first couple of weeks, what was it like being around these people with like great clothes and shoes and bags and shit?
Yeah, and I always felt like the other, you know what I mean? Like I talked earlier in our yarn about how the world reads me as a black fella outside of my community is very different to other family and friends. But I still, even going into the university space, felt like I was in a different world there, and how I grew up and, how people from my community got around wasn't necessarily something that fitted into the university sort of space. So I very much felt like I stuck out like a sore thumb. And that was the story for the rest of my journey. To be honest, it took me 8 years to do my degree. I had to do it part-time because the reality was I had to get a full-time job as soon as I could, because if I didn't, I couldn't survive. And so, I did my degree at night. I did it part-time, working 5 days a week, but studying on a Friday and night classes during the week. And that's just the reality of what I had to do to be able to do it. So you talked about equity at the start and people getting a fair go and starting at the same sort of pace. A fair go for me would have been able to, live at home for a little bit with some supportive family and have some resources to be able to support me to bring my full self to my course and all that sort of stuff. The reality was I had to provide that for myself and navigate how to do that in a world where my parents hadn't been educated past year 8, and no one in my family had ever been to university. This was something completely foreign for my family, but also anyone in my community. Didn't know anyone in my community that had been to university. So it was this whole new world and new sort of space. But I don't know, for me, I just really believe that if there was ever a way for me to transgress the intergenerational poverty, the world in which I'd grown up in, that I knew education was one of the most powerful tools that I could try and hold on to get there. And so that was always my anchor for never giving up. And, it took a long time, took twice as long as most people, but it was that belief that, it was critical to wanting something better for what I've been given.
You've spoken about this publicly, so I hope it's okay to bring up. But can you tell me about your early how your degree was subsidised early on by the cafeteria?
Yeah, you're saying that. Yeah. Look, that's some of those stories are the funniest because, like, they're the real nuanced realities of what it was like. So, like, I was like, before I even had a job in that first semester, I was living off, ab study and Centrelink payments, and they weren't going very far. And so they used to have this make your own sandwich cafe. They used to have them back in the day. I'm sure health and safety has ruled them out these days, but you could literally make your own sandwich and then you'd weigh it at the end of the table and then you'd pay for what it weighed. And peak hour at uni, like if anyone's ever been to uni, you'd know it's packed. So, I'll be there stacking up, the 6 foot Subway equivalent, and that'd be getting weighed, and then, or not getting weighed, I'd just be disappearing into the crowd of people. But that was, I had to survive, and I learnt the $2 boiled rice hack. I learnt that living in King's Cross because I would watch all these private school girls at the Thai cafe downstairs on a cold day with all this boiled rice. And I'd be like, one day I walked next door and I was like, well, what are all these girls buying? It was at St. Vincent's College. And they were like, oh, they buy boiled rice with satay sauce on it. And I'm like, oh, how much is that? They're like, oh, it's $2. I was like, oh, fuck, no one put me onto this. So that got me through that first semester of not starving, $2 boiled rice and, stealing my own sandwiches to get by. But, can I have a laugh about it? But at the time, it was a sad and it was a scary thing. Like sitting there thinking, like, I'm fucking starving and I'm going to steal this sandwich because if I don't, I've got to be here for another 6 hours and I've got nothing to do. I've got enough money to get home on the bus and that's it. So we can laugh now, but at the time, like you felt like shit. You felt like dog shit, having to do that sort of stuff. And it's just, it was the reality, it was what it was.
Mate, well, look, I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm glad you figured out a way to get fed. And yes, carbohydrates, protein, and some pretty good oils. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend living on it, but you can do it. Why criminology?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I'd never heard of criminology before. And I actually got into study teaching. I wanted to be a teacher. And I found it as an elective. And I was so interested in it because I came from a community full of crime, full of youth crime. And that was just so much of a lived reality of survival was crime. It was so normalized in my community. So I was really, really, when I saw this course called criminology, I got really interested in it because I was like, fuck, hang on, I know a lot about crime. Like, surely I'll do well in this course. And that's how the journey went. Like I went on and I fell in love with the course. I really got passionate about it. Some of that stuff I touched on earlier was less about the justice from a criminal perspective, but more about the justice from a social perspective. Because for me, I thought about crime in terms of our communities surviving, in terms of our communities, those lifestyles or those behaviours being normalised because of intergenerational trauma and poverty and all that sort of stuff as well. So that was what really drew me to it, was because I was like, I feel like there's a different lens here that needs to be brought to these conversations about crime and justice. It's not just about the big bad guys that are pure evil and just want to go out there and harm people. There's actually people out here that have grown up in worlds that are completely different to the ones that people are writing about or holding the pen, and so it was about trying to bring a bit of a narrative and perspective into that space as well. So that was the motivation there. And like doing my degree part-time, like it was a blessing in disguise in a lot of ways because I got to start my career journey early. I was very lucky to get my first job was working at the PCYC, which is a community youth club with police and working with kids at risk, very much like myself. So that got me started early. I went and worked with Red Cross. I worked in prisons with men coming out of jail. I worked in juvenile prisons with young women coming out of prison. So I had a really good journey working in that space and seeing firsthand the impacts of what we talked about at the start of this, a lot of the systemic barriers and realities that many people in these places haven't had a fair go. And for the most part, that's why they're in these places as well. It's because of how their lives have been carved out for them as young people.
You went on to create impact policy, which delivers a lot of projects around the kind of thing that we've been discussing, like pretty tricky things to do. Why did you feel it was important to start your company?
Yeah, I've been really interested in lived experience, and for a long time, Osher, I never talked about my lived experience because as a young person, I grew up in places where I would be at community forums or community meetings, and I would see like old aunties in our community say stuff that was really valid and relevant that would just be disregarded and labelled as angry black woman. Or I would see men in my community sit back, the most smartest and capable men sit back and not engage in these spaces and places because they hadn't been established as safe or culturally safe spaces for those people to bring their perspectives into those. So I got really conscious at a young age that I didn't want my lived experience to be disregarded as not relevant, or I just carried this baggage. So I went to university and I got my degree, I graduated with honours. I did really well with it academically. So then I had that pride. Okay, now maybe my lived experience is a bit more valid because I've got this degree now. But then still I was like, I went on in my professional career, and I managed to do some really great stuff there. And it was only when I got to the most sort of senior of places in the public sector that I felt like I had credibility now, that I could bring my lived experience into a conversation, and that it was backed by an evidence base academically, but it was also backed by years of professional experience at the most sort of senior of levels that people couldn't take away from my lived experience anymore. If anything, it was like the cherry on top, or it was like something that underpinned all that. So kicking off impact policy was really about a way of bringing those three pieces together, but really being grounded in the importance of co-design and community engagement with our communities. You know, so much policies get developed for our communities by people that are so far disconnected from those communities. We've talked about some of that stuff with child removal policies and stuff like that and justice already. But for me, that was one of the big motivations, is about, like, I really believe in the principles of co-design and co-designing solutions with people with lived experience.
It's so important. When I sat for a couple of years on the board at Sane Australia, it was at the start when it began. It's the oldest mental health charity in the country. It was an acronym for schizophrenia, a national emergency. I'm probably going to get the history kind of wrong, but it was just around when the kind of new antipsychotic drugs showed up and people no longer needed to be in asylums. You know, they could have a day room or whatever. But there were so many decisions being made about the lives of people living with schizophrenia by people who had never lived with schizophrenia or never knew anybody with schizophrenia. And, you know, another version of this we saw earlier this year in the States. You know, there was that incredible photo of all these people deciding, this is what women can do with their bodies. And there's this room of white men, not a uterus among them, deciding 100%. What is right and wrong for women to do with their own bodies. And so they're two examples. So, and so then to draw the analogy is like, why would you make any policy around any part of our community without a member of that community involved to go, actually, I see what you're doing here. However, in our community, for example, such and such culturally needs to have this person talk to them first. That's it. Oh, okay. Boom. Instantly, I've just made that up, but
totally.
You know, it makes no sense.
100%. And there are some sectors that try and do it better by having community representatives, but even then, I think about it from a power perspective, right, Osher? So, like, if you're on that board and you're the only person there who has a lived experience, what's the power imbalance, you know, in terms of the weight of your experience versus 8 other panel members that are experts, you know, in mental health? You know, it's almost 1 versus 8. And I see that all the time in Aboriginal communities where they bring in one Aboriginal representative who is then the voice for all Aboriginal communities and culture across New South Wales, you know, like. And so for me, I'm like, how do we get more people with lived experience that can build careers in these spaces and be empowered and not burn out and have long and fruitful careers in those areas too? And it's we have a way to go, but I feel like there's a piece of work there that can really have a systemic sort of impact.
What's something that people listening can do to support the kind of people who are at risk, the kind of people that you've got projects dedicated towards?
For people listening that want to get active and engaged, I think, you know, a big part of what we do is we try and raise awareness around critical stuff that's happening from a justice. You know, our core values are access, equity, inclusion, and justice. So a lot of the comms that we put out talk to a lot of current things that are happening in that sort of stuff at the moment. The biggest thing that we need people to be a part of is connecting with, you know, the hearts and minds of why this sort of stuff is critical and important. You know, we have a blog that came out last week that talked about the Senate inquiry into missing and murdered First Nations people in this country today. It's not so much also just about our work. It's about how do we seek opportunities to grow our understanding of some of these factors that are right here in our faces. You know, I don't want to get on and be plugging impact policy and all that sort of stuff. But if there's any survivors, particularly though, that are listening to this, that are, one thing I will say, if there's survivors here that are listening, survivors of a trauma or lived experience that they are still connected to professionally or they might do advocacy work for personally, we would really love to hear from you, because we're trying to build a network of professionals and practitioners that have lived experience, so we can really try and think about how we understand how best practice can look like in terms of supporting and empowering staff and professionals to be able to continue to do this work for the long term and stay well themselves. So if I can have any sort of call out to anyone listening, it's to connect with us around that.
Mate, it's a way of helping that has been proven. Like I'm in a fellowship of sobriety, shall we say, of people that help each other stay sober. And the guy that helps me to this day, 12 and a bit years later, like I only listened to what he was telling me because he had been drinking and using and been on the bones of his ass. And he went, yeah, I know what that's like. Happened to me. Now I'm married. Now I've got a, job. Now I've got a career. Like, oh, all right. If it was a person who'd never had the problem that I had, like, fuck, I'm going to listen to you.
Totally.
But it was so important. And similarly, when I got really sick, when I was going through all the psychosis shit, I needed to hear people who had been where I was and go and see that they were better now and go, oh, okay, I can't imagine how I'll ever get there, but you've done it. Maybe I could do it. And
definitely.
It's not rocket surgery. Like it's vital.
Totally.
And it's really powerful. It's a really powerful thing. And I'm bloody, geez, man, I'm glad you're doing it. We've got a lot of work to do, man. So if there's anything that I can do, don't hesitate, mate. I'm always around.
Hey, look, just one thing too on that. Like, I've been a massive fan of you, and I'll tell you why. And you'll know that I'm not just blowing smoke up your ass, because it's a really specific example. I run the Indigenous Marathon Foundation Father's Day Warrior Run. I run it every year, and that's one of the things that has pained me the most about COVID is that it's stopped since COVID sort of happened, but it ran for, I think, 4 years in a row, and I ran it every year that it ran. And there was, I think, at least 2 years in a row where I saw you there participating in the race. And I saw you the first time, maybe I saw you the second time, but when I remember I said to my partner, like, how good is it that he's there on Father's Day? Like, Father's Day, it's a special day. It's not just like I've rocked up on a casual Saturday, or my mates have dragged me there to be that part of this thing. You had a Deadly Choices Broncos, that's right, I did, Aboriginal design jumper on.
Arthur Beetson, first Queensland State of Origin captain. Thank you.
That's it. You had a bit of ochre slapped on, and
I did.
But what stood out for me the most is that there was no like posturing. There was no like, you have a profile, right? But it was a very much a place to celebrate Black excellence and community stuff. And you were just there participating in it, being a part of it, but there was no like show to any of that sort of stuff. And that's what sort of sold me on Osher right then and there. And I said it to my partner years ago. I said, he's a real one. And that's how he's a real one. And so when I got the opportunity to have a yarn with you, I was just like, mate, really, really stoked. So when you said that, that's why I wanted to share that little memory with you.
I appreciate that, mate. Thank you.
Talking.
Look, I could talk to you for a long time, but like I said, man, if there's anything I can do for you, I'm particularly interested in what we were talking about earlier about the criminalising of a trauma response in kids and raising the age and stuff like that, and that sort of stuff. I think is just fucking passion, man. It's just, it's not hard.
Totally.
The idea of what our prisons do, I don't think is the job we want them to do. Because at this point, there's no amount of time that anyone who goes inside can do before their next door neighbour will feel comfortable about them moving in. Doesn't matter what they did,
Totally.
And for that prisoner, there's no amount of time that has passed since they got out that'll pass until people treat them like they used to treat them. And that's shit. And, something's got to be done around that. Particularly if it's just a criminalising a trauma response.
Totally.
As you mentioned, so there's a lot of work to do there. But look, it means there's something to do everywhere. So
that's it. That's it.
It's easy to find a thing to start on. Let me know if I can do anything for you, Sam. You're a bloody legend, buddy.
Nah, you too, bro. You too. I've really appreciated you taking the time.